hope you all are doing well and enjoying the last few days of sunshine, and maybe today taking a little rest day as it rains, and it's gonna ice and snow here shortly, I hear. So, hopefully you've been able to submit your essay, and I've graded a majority of them. There's a few out there still, so if you want to send those to me, I'd be happy to still take a look and comment on them. I do have them scored, but I can't put anything into the grade book now. I'll try to get those in as soon as the district opens those up to us to start entering scores. Other than that, great essays. Hopefully you enjoyed the feedback, and hopefully you've also started your narrative of the life of a slave, Frederick Douglass. And there was some pre-reading activity. I'll go through that with you. And then I'd also love to go through the 2 letters of introduction and the first chapter. I'll introduce you all to my partner. This is Maggie, so everybody say hi to Maggie. I know. She's been my running partner the last few days. So hopefully you've been able to get out and enjoy some too. All right, so let's get back on track here. Narrative of the life of a slave. What you needed to know, just looking at the context of when this book was written. That's all about exigence, right? We think about our audience and our purpose, and of course the writer himself. And so one of the things we want to look at is, this was published in 1845. Around the time, this is pre-Civil War, of course, because Civil War 1861, right? So pre-Civil War America, it was really tense with the abolitionists and anti-abolitionists. There were even some violent riots, right, in Pennsylvania at the time. So Frederick Douglass, he escaped slavery in Maryland in 1838, you probably found out. And but he had some experience prior to that with slavery further down in the South. So he had a lot to bring to the table in terms of that first person experience. But you have to think about the audience at the time. So the audience at the time would have these misconceptions that slaves could not read or write, were not intelligent, had subpar intelligence, actually enjoyed slavery because slave owners were the only people who really published any stories about slavery itself. So they had to work with a misconception of the public. One of the abolitionists that helped to do that was William Lloyd Garrison and, of course, Wendell Phillips. But William Lloyd Garrison, he was really the first one to start pushing that abolitionist movement. And he had the newspaper The Liberator that did so, and he also was part of the Anti-Slavery Society, founded it. And this is all at the time, too, where suffrage is happening. So we have, of course, the women's movement for the right to vote that kind of latches onto this abolitionist movement as well. So to abolish slavery, but also that idea that equal rights extend to everyone. So those were some of the things I was hoping you would find out about. So William Lloyd Garrison, and kind of his sidekick, right, is Wendell Phillips, who is a lawyer, but also joins the Anti-Slavery Society, and actually marries one of the forefront speakers for the women's suffrage movement as well. So in any case, you have these really powerful spokespeople who are in Douglass's corner. And what they have to do is they have to support Frederick Douglass, but not only support him, they have to endorse him. So because the public is going to think, Frederick Douglass may not have written this himself, or can a slave really write? Can a slave really have the intellectual power to expose the truth about slavery, or really understand his own predicament? And so the 2 letters that you see at the very beginning with William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, you see William Lloyd Garrison, it's actually kind of interesting, you probably already thought this, but he talks about his own experience in meeting Douglass. So he actually doesn't talk, he talks about his own observing, and really kind of, he's like, and about me, so he takes Frederick Douglass's story, but really makes it about himself and his experience, which is kind of funny. But of course, it's all the while endorsing Frederick Douglass, that he wrote this himself. He has the intellectual capacity, to write this narrative, and he's someone who understands what's happening in terms of slavery as an institutionalized system. So that's that whole preface. So he talks about meeting Douglass, and 1841 in Nantucket, and he talks about the abolitionist movement, um, and then, of course, how the audience really loved Douglass and was invested in him. The other thing you have to consider is that Frederick Douglass is taking a huge risk in speaking out to the public and in publishing his story. He's an escaped slave. He's not a free slave. So, you also have the Fugitive Slave Act, which says that at any time the owners can come back and take those slaves back into slavery. And even freed slaves were taken by the same act, right? The Fugitive Slave Act. And so he really puts himself in peril by exposing himself as an escaped slave. And of course, the audience is, yes, it's abolitionists, but it's also slave owners who want to know, how did this guy get free? What does he think about slavery? What is he telling people? So Douglass really has to think about those two audiences, and how does he manage that? What kind of tone does he need to set? What kind of information is he willing to share? Why is he willing to share that? And because his purpose is obviously going to be exposing the evils of slavery, and arguing obviously against its institution as a whole, and arguing that slaves have humanity, intellectual capacity that is equal to even to slave owners themselves, and of course the general public. So that's a lot going on in terms of the purpose. The second letter we see is from Wendell Phillips, and his letter is a little bit more argumentative about the authenticity of the story. And so he kind of engages with the counter argument, what slave owners might say, what are some of the misconceptions that the audience might have. And so he talks about, slave owners are the ones who have published most of the stories, and here you're going to get the authentic story of Douglass. And yes, he was a slave in Maryland, but before that, so it really speaks to the authenticity of the story and anticipates some of the counter argument that the audience might have, which he is a lawyer, so that makes sense that would be the content of his letter. The other thing I wanted you to do is just look at the front, right, the cover. And so what are some of the things in terms of the choices here? And of course the title, right, An American Slave Written by Himself, and that's the full title. So this idea that it's this novelty act, right, or it's this abnormality, or could it really be, written by a slave? And so it already takes into account what the audience might, some of the misconceptions. The other thing that's interesting here, and you'll notice this on a few covers, but you see a very whited out portrait of Frederick Douglass himself. And so that's kind of interesting as well. You also have the contrast of that black and white, which is, obviously central to our issue. So it's really, you can look at some of the different covers, but really we don't see much stray from this particular cover. Okay, so getting to, let's get to that first chapter and see how that went for you. So just chapter 1, and I'm looking here at the very beginning, right? Let's read this just first paragraph together. I was born in Tuckahoe near Hillsboro and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far and large a part of the slaves I know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. What's interesting there about the choices when you look at that? What does he start with? Well, he starts with this idea of location, and really specific location. So you have this, I was born in Tuckahoe near Hillsboro, 12 miles. So he pinpoints the exact location of his birth, right? But that's juxtaposed, right? This is knowledge. He's showing that he knows this. And then that's juxtaposed by the next sentence, which says he has no knowledge of the date of his birth. So we have that juxtaposition in order to expose to the audience, hey, look, I know exactly where I was born, the exact location. I may not know the date, but that is not an intellectual fault. That's actually a part of the system. So he talks about many slaves don't know their birth dates, much like an animal, right? A horse, so to speak. But he talks about this as a flaw of the institution of slavery, not of a flaw of the slaves themselves. right? He says, most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. So it's an intentional keeping of knowledge, of information, that leads to the dehumanization. It's about power and control, right? And here, right, keeping that knowledge from the slaves as a form of control. And what's interesting is, as you'll see as we get to the end, you remember that Douglas has the power to keep some of the knowledge about the escape of slaves from his audience. And so that's one of the interesting things to keep in mind here, is that Douglas is now taking control of his own story, of his own narrative. And he's going to have the power to tell the story. So let's go a little bit more into this text, right? Into this first chapter. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell his birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me, even during my childhood. The white children could tell their ages, and I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on a part of a slave improper and impertinent, an evidence of a restless spirit. The near estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say, sometime during 1835, I was about 17 years old. My mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was of darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father. And the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. So part of this, of course, is talking to the pathos, right? The emotions of the reader. You can see Douglas is trying to identify with his audience, right? And he's creating a separateness, right, from his experience as a slave or from being a slave. So you can see in that first paragraph he talks about slaves I know, most of them cannot blah, 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 right? So he says, they seldom come nearer to it, right? I do not remember ever having met a slave who could. And so in this way, he's separating himself from being a slave, right? To having the audience view him as a slave, and instead someone who's an expert on slavery. And so that's one way in which he really wants to create an equality with his audience so that they're able to empathize with him instead of sympathize. Because sympathize here, he wants to create a sympathy for the slaves, but he cannot do that necessarily with himself because of the idea, again, of power, right? If we simply feel bad for somebody, it's because we feel that we're in a position of power. So he wants to create an understanding that, wow, that's a human experience that I could have had should I have been in that predicament. Because Frederick Douglass and I, we both seem to have the same intellectual capacity to understand a situation. So understanding that real human empathy needs to be part of that part of his argument. Douglas wants to create that pathos, but in order to do so, he has to put himself on an equal playing field with his audience. And that's where he starts to do that, right? He creates that separation, and yet also then he needs to put himself in a position of being the expert on slavery. So he talks about his own experience, right? So he talks about the separateness, but then goes into the recall and how he was able to find out this information about his own heritage, right, and parentage. And of course, he's drawing on something that's quite controversial at the time, that about his father as master, right? And so that's really going to draw the attention of the audience. But he also needs to talk about, the reality of that situation for those who experience slavery. And that is a reality that probably most slave owners would not have written about as of yet. before the child has reached its 12th month, the mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection toward its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. So again, that play on pathos, that mother-child relationship. Of course, most of his audience is going to be able to understand or feel that emotional strain. Of course, it's again about preventing knowledge, preventing relationships, which of course puts not only the slave owner in a position of power, but also hopefully prevents insurrection and riots and rebellion, etc. I never saw my mother to know her as much more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration at night. She was hired by Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me at night, traveling the whole distance on foot, after the performance of her day's work. She was not a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get, and one that gives to him that gives it the proud name of being a kind master. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended with what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old, on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during the illness, at her death, or burial. So again, this is all about pathos, right? She was gone long before I knew anything about it, neither having enjoyed any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care. I received the tidings of her death with much of the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. So we see the preventing, right, of the slave owners and masters, preventing this, mother-child relationship from ever forming. And it's really devastating, and it's devastating to Douglass, and he talks about it here as being a devastating reality of slavery. And of course, any audience member, especially abolitionists, are going to feel that pathos, right? That pull of that, emotion, that need, right? Wanting the most basic human experience to be one that understands compassion and relationship. Called thus suddenly away, she left me without the slightest intimation of who my father was. The whisper was that the master my father may or may not be true or false. It is of little consequence to my purpose while the facts remain, and all of its glaring odiousness. The slave owners have ordained, and by law established, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow in the condition of their mothers, and this is done to obviously administer their own lusts, and make gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For any cunning arrangement, the slaveholder, in cases not few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father. So Frederick Douglass then, of course, brings it back, now that he has the audience in the grips of the pathos, coming back to the idea of his father. So his father as a slave owners only tend to profit, right, from the pregnancy of slaves. And so because their children then become slaves, right? So they get another slave, so to speak. But of course, this probably is cause for concern for the audience, because many of course, the slave owners were probably married at the time. Then we're talking about slave owners who consider the slaves as property, right? And so that imbalance of power, is that ethical, moral? So all of that comes into play here. So not only do we have marriage outside of marriage, you have those relationships outside of marriage, which would not be condoned, right, by the audience. And then of course you also have that idea of power, and then the hypocrisy of the slave owners themselves. If indeed you're sleeping with property or someone you deem to be the same intellect as an animal, that just kind of that ethically doesn't align and logically doesn't make sense. I know of such cases, and it is worthy of remark that such slaves invariably suffer greater hardships and have more to contend with than others. They are in the first place a constant offense to their mistress. She is ever disposed to find fault with them. They can seldom do anything to please her. She is never better pleased than when she sees them under the lash, especially when she suspects her husband of showing to his mulatto children favors which he withholds from his black slaves. The master is frequently compelled to sell this class of slaves out of deference to the feelings to his white wife, and cruel as the deed may be to strike anyone to be, for a man to sell his own children to human fleshmongers is often the dictate of humanity for him to do so. For unless he does, he must not only whip them himself, but stand by and see one white son tie up his brother, and but of a few shades darker complexion than himself, ply the gory lash to his naked back. So he also talks about, wow, that must be really hard for these slave owners who do have children with their slaves. They put themselves in quite a predicament. They need to do a few of the following things. They either are going to have to beat their children and watch other people beat them just because of the circumstance, or they're going to have to sell them into maybe another horrible situation. And of course, no human being is going to want that for their own children. So the audience, right? And that's what Douglas is telling the audience. No one worth any humanity would want to sell their children into servitude or watch them be beaten in front of them. So he puts that into a logical conundrum for the audience, and that's of course really well done here. So yeah, you're getting into the first chapter. He gets into his two masters, and then his first master is on page 24, and that's Master Anthony. And then, of course, you have the occurrence with Aunt Hester on page 25. So you have Douglas as an observer of slavery, and really closes out chapter 1 as an observer. In fact, he's in the closet while Aunt Hester is being beaten, and he's watching this happen. But he himself is not engaged personally in the violent act resulting from his position in slavery. And so we kind of see this gentle entrance into a very harsh reality and harsh story that Douglas is going to tell. But he, of course, has to ease the audience into it, because otherwise I think, he really probably would have put them off, or if he just jumped right into violence, of course, the audience is going to be doubtful. So he has to spend the time to create that relationship with the audience, put himself in a position of power to tell the story, put himself in a position to credibility, right, to authentically tell the story, and have his audience believe his credibility, and then of course put himself on the same level in order to make that pathos effective. And so the very last excerpt from chapter 1 is going to be with Aunt Hester. And I'll just read that last paragraph, and we'll close out with that. And then I would like you to finish reading the chapters 1 through 8, and then we'll talk about your assignment, and of course I'll post that too. So I know this video is getting a little long. It's like a whole class period. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in the company of Lloyd's Ned, which circumstance I found from what he said while whipping her was the chief offense. Had he been a man of pure morals himself, he might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt, but those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time, bleep bleep. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, and put in for his purpose. He made her get upon the stool, tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up to their full length, so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "Now I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on a heavy cowskin and assume warm red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her, and horrid oaths from him came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight that I hid myself in the closet, and dared not venture out long until after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she put to raise children of the younger women. I had therefore been, until now, out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred at the plantation. So that's his segue, right, into some of the real grit that he's going to get into in the following chapters. So you can see him peering out of the closet, but you also, it's, kind of a metaphor for what's going to be opening up to the audience, opening the door, if you will, to the realities of slavery that he's going to talk about in the following chapters. So chapters 1 through 8. You can certainly read more than just the chapters 1 through 8. Of course, the following weeks will be hopefully doing this, I guess, together in this method. Let me know if if you have some ideas about how I can make this easier for you, or help you with analysis. Please feel free to email me. You have my number. You can call, message, whatever you need. I'm here for you. And what I'd like you to do is, if you looked on Canvas, you'll see I have an analysis question for you. So just looking at the first 8 chapters, think about how you might analyze Douglas's strategies and according to his purpose. And I did put my own example on there. Yours doesn't have to be that lengthy. It can. I'm going to ask you to work with a partner, maybe no more than 3 people, so you can share a document on Google Docs, or you could also just maybe FaceTime and have one person be the writer, so you could do it that way. And I think you should probably be able to put something together pretty well by Wednesday. So if you could email me your analysis by Wednesday, I'll go ahead and give you some feedback. And don't worry, I have been keeping scores just in case they do open up our gradebook. So I have those all recorded here. You're not going to lose credit for anything, but I certainly won't, I won't put anything in until they allow us to do so. So, yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Those are the assignments, and then what I'll have you do next week too, or if you're watching this on Monday, this week. So this week, if this is Monday, on Wednesday, have those analysis. Just go ahead and email those to me, or you can share them, whatever. And then by Friday, I'd really like you to have read chapters 9 and 10. And I'll do another video for analyzing chapters 9 and 10 to help you out with the next assignment. So, yeah, have a great weekend, everyone. I sure do miss you. And hopefully we get to resume some kind of normalcy by April 24th. Until then, take care and, enjoy the outdoors, enjoy this experience. It may be once in a lifetime, so I guess maybe just try to find some relaxation in it, because I know you all lead some pretty hectic schedules and hectic lives. So let it just be a rest for you. Time to enjoy your family and talk with friends, journal, read, exercise, spend time with your doggies if you have one. And we'll talk to you guys next week. Have a good one.